more and more communication capability. But cable was sort of, access cable was sort of was out there on the frontier before there was, let's say, non-commercial use of internet, and so forth. So there's an alliance, I think, of thinking between the access, the traditional thought of it, and the internet. Welcome very much to Conversations, where it's a pleasure to welcome once again to the program Ambassador Ahmad Kamal. He's a former ambassador of Pakistan to the United Nations. He's currently president of the Ambassadors Club at the United Nations. And Ahmad Kamal, welcome very much to Conversations.
Pleasure to be with you again.
Yeah, we're talking now on November 21st, just a couple of months after the events at the World Trade Center. I wonder maybe you could, we're going to want to take it with a particular perspective toward the view from and understanding the situation from the standpoint of Pakistan. But I wonder, the events of September 11th, everyone says the world has changed forever. I wonder what, in a general sense, your reflections are on the implications of what happened after 9/11.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that the 11th of September was an event which is going to impact our lives for years to come around the world. So the word war or even world war has been correctly used for this event. There are different aspects to it which we have all considered and spoken about, but perhaps it would be useful to restate them.
Yes.
And I can think of 4 aspects of the 11th of September which are particularly important. The first is that this was a tragedy of a certain magnitude. There are 6,000 people who died.
Yes.
And while death comes to all of us, there are 6,000 families which are affected by the tragedy. And that means that people are going to be affected for years to come because of having lost a bread earner or whatever. There are 16,000 children, and 2,000 of whom are orphans now. And that means that it's going to affect their lives for the next 40, 50, 60 years. So the magnitude of the tragedy is very great. And that's the first point.
Yeah.
The second, which is an obvious point, is that it has hit the United States on its own soil.
Yes.
Now that is important because the United States has always been seen by the rest of the world as a solution to their problems.
That's interesting.
Whenever the world has had problems in World War I, World War II, you have turned towards the United States to come and help resolve the problem. But now the United States is party to the problem itself, and it becomes an actor who is involved in the whole thing, and that's a different level altogether.
Do you think that that view of the world toward the United States as being able to be offering of a solution is growing in its magnitude in terms of through time?
I'm not too sure of that.
All right,
I'm not
that's
too
an
sure.
interesting question. Yeah.
Because that is the impact of this situation on the world. The third aspect which is important is the technique of terrorism that was used. Terrorism has always been a technique of an individual or a group wearing explosives or carrying explosives in a car or a truck. This is something totally new because the basic weapon which has been used is motivation and not weaponry itself. The actual weapon is box cutters and things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we are at a loss. It's a quantum leap in the technique of terrorism, and it puts all of us at a loose end because we know how to deal with weapons, but we don't quite know how to deal with motivations.
I wonder if you could, you've had a long experience in the UN and the various agencies and so forth around the world. Have there been attempts, and I've seen some discussion that there should be a conference at the UN in order to try and get at a definition of what we mean by terrorism. It seems to be we've declared a war against something that has not been clearly defined exactly what we mean. And is it difficult to parse out or to differentiate between terrorism that is being enacted by the very powerful against those who are not powerful, or state terrorism by the powerful against those? But in realpolitik and geopolitical thinking, violence has worked in order to help establish the conditions which exist in the world. And I wonder if it's important. Can we get at a definition of what we mean exactly by terrorism, and how do we differentiate it between?
I don't know. We've been trying for decades to
UN?
differentiate, to define terrorism and to differentiate between terrorism and what is called the legitimate struggle of peoples for self-determination.
Absolutely. We couldn't do it in '86 when Mandela was called a terrorist by much of the world
Ye-
and the African National Congress, and we couldn't get a definition through because they wanted to reserve the right for people who were being colonized in order to fight the occupation.
And who knows, had this terrorism debate taken place at the time of American independence, George Washington would have been a terrorist from the British point of view.
No doubt. I think
So-
that he was in a certain sense called that, and Hitler in the Balkans called the partisans who fought against the Nazi occupation terrorists.
Yeah.
The term has been used. That's why I'm saying it's something that, is it worthwhile, or is it just, I know we've had difficulty at the UN even defining what we mean exactly by aggression.
Well, we're trying
So-
to get there. The other problem in terrorism is that we have 12 conventions against terrorism, but they all deal with how to deal with the person who commits an act of terrorism. There is nothing in these conventions about a person who instigates or inspires terrorism. So there's a major loophole there.
Yeah.
And the Security Council has tried to step into that loophole, but we will no doubt have to move forward into a legal, comprehensive framework, because we are faced with an event of great magnitude, and if nothing else, it will shake us into going forward to define a comprehensive definition and action against terrorist acts of all types, including state-sponsored terrorism, where the instruments of state themselves
Yes.
indulge in terrorist actions, and there are umpteen examples around the world
Well,
of states
yeah,
doing terrorism.
Yes, indeed. It's the first principle of realpolitik in a certain sense, that violence in a certain sense has, over the historical experience, worked.
Yes. But what astonishes me again about this 11th of September is perhaps the fourth point, which is that the United States is a very powerful country with very powerful means at its disposal, including very fine intelligence services. And it is inconceivable to me as to how one could have gone in for people who have stayed here for 5 years and studied and been in the American environment for 5 years with a single-minded purpose of conducting an act of terrorism, and that the intelligence agencies of the country did not get wind of it. It is truly extraordinary as a loophole.
Yeah, it would be. That they must have kept great secrecy over a considerable period of time, and they were able to do it without a great deal of more idiosyncratically to the group than perhaps some people tend to think. You have to have great planning and so forth, and maybe it doesn't have to be so planned. It's what's in the hearts of the people, like jazz musicians get together and jam at 4 a.m. after the, they just do it, and that would make it more. There's a term now, idiopathic, where a behavior pattern stands out instead of being linked into an organizational structure. It's just widely felt. It's the basis of what is loosely called a movement, and there's a movement against the system that's in place in the hearts and minds of a great number of people around the country, and they take actions sort of, in a sense, spontaneously, compared to some big battle plan that's established
But
on
this
a
is
war room
this is
chart
not
somewhere.
this is not spontaneous. This is very well thought out,
Okay.
and the motivation is very, very deep.
Very.
And so the critical element of the 11th of September is really in the motivation. And that then takes us, because we have to then analyze the motivation, we have to analyze the why and the root causes of that motivation. Because unless we get to the bottom of those root causes, we will not be able to prevent a recurrence of such types of acts, perhaps in entirely new techniques or new areas. There are major different loopholes which are possible all the time.
Yes, indeed.
Now, we've given some thought to this idea of possible root causes. And I can think of 4, none of which may be independently the root cause, or perhaps all of them are jointly, or perhaps only one of them is. But the 4 also need to be listed. The first root cause is quite obviously, the possible root cause lies in the Middle East, in the Israel-Palestine conflict. But note that the action has not been taken against Israel. It has been taken against the United States,
Yeah.
which means that it is not Israeli policies which are being objected to, but American support for those policies, which is the motivation.
Yeah.
And that's very interesting,
Yeah.
that it is the United States is being held responsible in some ways for whatever is happening in the Middle East, where an outright support to one out of two parties has created deep frustration in the second party.
I wonder if that theme could be taken larger in a certain sense and say the United States is, there's been a great deal of talk saying that the United States has emerged as the superpower since 1989 and so forth, that we are responsible in a certain sense to a large degree for the system that is in place, largely in terms of operating the economics and politics of this interrelated spaceship Earth. And there are a number of people, apart from just Islamic, there are other people around the world who in a certain sense feel that the system that is in place, we have the Bretton Woods institutions, we have the United Nations, we have Mr. Wolfenson, we have people who sense that the system that is in place is not adequate to, or is not going to be able to lead to a situation of alleviating the plight of the vast majority of the population on this planet. There are signs that the tendency for there to be greater wealth accumulation by the wealthy compared to the mass of the people of the world, and that there are people who feel existentially the system that we're being asked to support, the system that's in place, led by the United States, is not worthy of support, and there will be an existential challenge coming from those quarters if they sense that the leadership of the world is asking them to follow a path that will lead to a lemming's leap and will not be able to address the problems because of a lack of vision of economics or a lack of vision of how the planet is to be run, and that at that level it's not just Islamic. There are probably great numbers of people around the world who feel that way.
But you are then thinking on a much higher plane than
trying
I
to be
was,
more
because
inclusive.
that is, and we could go into this as a fifth possible root cause, because there's no doubt that you are right, that there is dissatisfaction or concern with a sole surviving superpower which encourages the world to go towards a consensus on basic principles,
Yes.
but then at the last minute does not sign on to those principles itself. This is, if you wish, what we saw at the end of World War I, when the United States encouraged everybody to set up a League of Nations, but did not sign on itself. And I could give you half a dozen treaties: the International Criminal Court, the Kyoto Protocol on Climate Change, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. There's a long, long list of these treaties,
And it's been
which have been encouraged by the United States, but which the United States has not signed on to finally.
particularly perhaps in just the political context of the recent context. We have a president of the United States who's, and it's not your business to criticize the United States, but we had a president who came in by passing a huge tax cut, $2 trillion tax cut that eliminated what was seen as a surplus that had been built up, and most of that, an inordinate amount of that went to the upper 1% of the population. It was a tax cut to the wealthy. They bring a stimulus package in now in order to have economic difficulties. Again, it goes to the most wealthy groups within the society, and a lot of people feel that's marking a path in the road that is going in the wrong direction in terms of what the world needs, in terms of whatever visionary leadership is going to be leading it away from conditions that create the context where mass discontent, almost existential angst and upset manifests itself with things like terrorist activities.
But I'm not too sure. You see, the problem of leadership is that a leader has to choose between two different options, both of which are equally interesting and attractive.
Yeah.
And leadership is choice. It's only history will tell as to whether correct choices are being made in the type of leadership that is exercised. Root causes again.
Yes.
The Middle East is a possible root cause. A second root cause could be in Saudi Arabia, because after all, 16 out of the 19 hijackers are Saudis, and so we have to examine that a bit more carefully. It is possible that there is some degree of frustration in Saudi Arabia that we are not fully aware of, and that frustration is being vented once again on the United States, because the United States has a strategic alliance with Saudi Arabia, particularly on matters relating to oil.
And troops in the land of Mecca and Medina, which is an upset to a great number of Islamic.
A root cause. The third root cause could be in Iraq, because in Iraq we have now had 10 years of sanctions, and they have caused a lot of devastation for the Iraqi public, and unfortunately have caused no deep concern to the government of Iraq at all. And so the idea was to be able to hit the government of Iraq and to save the people of Iraq, but what we have achieved is quite the contrary. And it is possible that that sets off enormous frustration both among the Iraqi population and possibly in the periphery among Arabs who see this as unfair to an Iraqi population.
Or people of conscience around the world who look at it because we see figures of 500,000 children perhaps that have needlessly come to an end of their life and that sort of thing as a result of that. Madame Albright said it was a price we had to pay. That is passed around. There are other people who say there's enough there and it's just that he does not distribute it. It's his fault. That is Saddam Hussein's fault. And try to say that
yes, but the end product is unhappiness of a people. And that creates frustration, and frustration then creates the type of motivation that we've seen. A possible fourth root cause could be in Egypt. Egypt is a very large country.
Indeed.
And unlike Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, etc., it's a critical mass of people. And it has a fairly long history of having to deal with extremist Islamic views. The Muslim Brotherhood was established in the 1930s, I think.
The 30s,
and made life impossible for one king and two presidents and possibly three presidents. So that may be another possible root cause. It could be what you referred to, which is a general dissatisfaction with the sole surviving superpower. Leadership a leader is a person who stands out, and because you stand out, therefore you are the target always, because you are visible. And the United States is visible as a sole surviving superpower.
Well, we have seen these things from other quarters in terms of that. The demonstrations that occurred at the G8 meeting in Genoa, where they had 200,000 young people in the streets. You had one death result from that. We had the thing in Seattle, and they're protesting in a certain sense, trying to protest to the frustration of some people who are responsible for the system that's in place. They're protesting in general the system that's in place, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. Mr. Wolfenson will say we are doing as best we possibly can in order to alleviate the suffering of the masses of the world, but Maurice Strong and other people will come along and say the trends are disquieting, that the trends that are there, that we have meetings in five-star hotels by very well-to-do people who set up conditions that make the 20% of the plutocratic elements within each of the states that seem to be at the top of the society better for them, but it doesn't get down, and the trends are that it's not going to be able to meet the needs of the vast majority of the population of this planet, and it should be in a certain sense challenged, and the leadership, intellectual or political or business, hasn't come up with a vision that is able to resonate significantly to gain the support of the masses of the world, so that this thing could be a critique of the system that's in place that is larger than, let's say, what Mr. bin Laden even has.
Yes, but then that becomes very worrying.
It does indeed.
Because if there is that type of dissatisfaction, then the motivation is not really against the United States. It's a motivation of general frustration because of unemployment, because of abject poverty, because of a gap which is growing, because of an inability of a multilateral sector to find solutions.
And the projection of the trends is not able to say there's light at the end of the tunnel in the minds of an increasing number of people around the planet.
And then if that is the perception, then people get frustrated, and then they have to do something to vent their frustration. And the easiest person to vent your frustration against is the leader, which in this case is the United States.
Well, the leading element, that would be the intellectual world leadership community, including the intellectuals, political theory, economic theory, and so forth, that there's something, as Bobby Dylan used to say, blowing in the wind that has not been picked up on by those who would presume to be representing the leading edge of how we are going to utilize our technologically augmented capability and bring a systems-wide inclusion of the whole of 6 billion people heading for 10 into a workable order. So
Possible. But you see, if you analyze the 19 people who committed this act,
yes,
they definitely come from a very compressed geographical area.
yeah.
So it cannot be universal dissatisfaction. There's a lot of dissatisfaction, I'm sure, on those grounds in Africa.
Oh, I'm certainly.
Because
You got 17 million people have been allowed to die of AIDS.
Okay,
and what have we been able to muster in that, as much as we try?
Yes, but there are no Africans among these hijackers.
Not yet.
Yes.
Not yet.
So,
we have an incipient kind of thing going in the country of Colombia now in South America. We have military advisors in the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and it's in other places that are not. It's not only Islamic, as what I'm trying to say. We have dissatisfaction, perhaps breeding even in the United States of America.
Quite right.
Yeah.
But I still feel that the 11th of September and its aftermath has a more focused geographic origin.
Yeah.
But be as it may, I mean, we have taken action against...
we being the United States?
No, we being much wider than the United States. We have taken action in Afghanistan because the thesis is that the instigation has been done by one particular person with a network which is amorphous, which is sitting very, very non-transparently in different places in the world, and that this setup has been given succor and safe haven by a political regime called the Taliban, and therefore the Taliban and Osama bin Laden have to be eliminated. And action has been taken, and countries like Pakistan have stood shoulder to shoulder once again with the United States, partly because Pakistan, like other countries, has itself suffered from terrorism, and therefore understands the need for action, partly because Afghanistan is next door to Pakistan, therefore it's very important for us to know what happens in Pakistan because there's a fallout.
Absolutely crucial.
Pakistan has a legitimate interest in Afghanistan. We have a border with the country which is approximately equal to the border between the United States and Mexico, almost 1,800 miles of border. It's a porous border.
Yes.
It does not have a Rio Grande on it. So movement is relatively porous. We have links with Afghanistan which go deep into history for hundreds of years. We have a common cultural, religious pattern of life. We have family ties and ethnic ties which cross the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan all the time. And so obviously anything which happens in Afghanistan is of interest to Pakistan. Add to this the fact that whenever Afghanistan has been in trouble, Afghans have sought refuge in Pakistan. And that is how, when the Soviets walked in and stayed there for 10 years in one of the most brutal invasions that could be possible. It's, in fact, it amazes me that the Russians should have walked into Afghanistan, should have occupied it for 10 years, should have killed 1.5 million Afghans.
Losing only, I think, 15 or 20,000 themselves.
Whatever
no, but I mean,
they
that's
lost.
a huge...
But having
1.5 million
planted
Afghans.
1.5 million,
Incredible.
having displaced 7 million Afghans, of whom 5 million became refugees outside their country, having planted, I think, 15 million landmines, of which about 9 million are still in the soil, and then having lost a war and walked away without paying 1 penny in reparations. Never in history have we seen this.
Well, they were very busy. They were very busy, as it were, coming up to '89 or so, with an incoming implosion of their system that was happening. It was a large development. And you said earlier about how we had not caught, the intelligence community had not caught the, you know, the bombing of the World Trade Center. The intelligence community had missed, as it were, the implosion of the Soviet Union. Another
Also,
very large development that in their, you know, it makes one wonder whether the, you know, the intelligence, you know, how much trust you can put in the intelligence agencies themselves. But, yeah.
But be as it may,
Yeah.
we have a problem in Afghanistan because we've bombed, and the Taliban, who were in many ways a sort of a pimple on the face of Afghan history, have been compressed and will probably disappear.
Maybe you could, if you would, straighten this out, because you understand it well. It's confusing to myself and to numbers. I mean, to others. In Afghanistan, we have these ethnic identities, and we have the Pashtun. So we have terms that have been, we have the Pashtun, which I understand are, and that overlaps into Pakistan, northwest frontier and so forth, and there's that linkage. And then we have this concept, maybe you could straighten and differentiate. We have the Taliban, that's a group, and we have the Al-Qaeda. Now, can you set those in place? And how important is it that whatever government emerges in Afghanistan, that there be a representation of the Pashtun? And is that an important thing for us to understand? Or
There are two separate matters.
Please.
The first is that there is an ethnic structure to Afghanistan. Approximately half of the country is Pashtun.
Okay.
The remaining half is shared among three major ethnic communities: the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and the Hazaras.
These are long, deep in history, ethnic identities that
They are different languages.
Languages?
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
They are different languages. The
And there
Tajiks, for example,
Mhm.
speak Tajik, which is a Persian language.
I see.
The Uzbeks speak Uzbek, which is a Turkish language. The Pashtuns speak Dari, which is closer to Pakistan, and Urdu and Persian. These are three distinct ethnic things. But the Pashtuns are half of the country.
Half of
And
Afghanistan.
that cannot be denied.
Yeah. And it overlaps, does it not, geographically into Peshawar and so forth?
Many
Yeah?
of them are on the Pakistan side also.
And there have been accusations by the Tajik or the Northern Alliance that the Taliban had been supported by Pakistan.
The Taliban are all Pashtuns.
They're all
basically.
Pashtun.
They're all Pashtuns.
So there's Pashtuns, and then there are some of the Pashtuns are Taliban, and the Taliban are student leaders who brought some unity to Afghanistan after the tribal warfare decimated a good deal of the country following the withdrawal of the Soviet Union.
That is correct.
And
When
what
the
was it they
Soviets-
brought that was able to bring the unity that they were able to do? A puritanical form of Islam, or how can we understand this?
When the Russians withdrew, there were 7 political parties, 7 ethnic communities that had been fighting the Russians. And the assumption was that once the Russians withdrew, the 7 would get together and would produce a broad-based political dispensation in Afghanistan.
There were all those guns.
That did not happen. They started fighting with each other
Yeah.
because basically
Yeah.
the Tajiks don't like the Uzbeks don't like the Pashtuns, nobody likes each other. These are mountain tribes which are isolated but which cannot quite agree with each other.
Okay.
And at that stage,
yeah.
the Tajiks were chosen by all of them to take charge of Kabul for the specific purpose of organizing elections in Afghanistan in a 10-month time frame.
This is after the Soviet.
This is 1992.
Okay.
And they didn't do it.
They couldn't. They
No, they didn't do it.
They set themselves
They hung
up
on
and-
to power. They got themselves
Lord
prolonged.
Acton said it, didn't he?
And in fact, they created a law and order situation in which people were massacred all over Afghanistan. We saw refugees still coming into Pakistan. There were rapes, there were murders all over the country.
By the Tajik against the Pashtun and others. Huh?
Yes.
And
so
it was along ethnic lines that this was
It
done?
was basically, no, it was a complete breakdown of law and order.
I see.
Afghanistan became, if you want, a failed state.
And there were all
At that
those...
stage, the Taliban emerged from the woodwork as a sort of a unifying puritanical force which made sure that there would be security and law and order, and in all the areas that they controlled, because of a very extremist puritanical version of Islam that they practiced, there was law and order, but there were no human rights. And particularly the rights of women were relegated into too much of the background. Women's rights were trampled upon under Taliban leadership.
And there had been all of the support by the United States and others that went through Pakistan up to support the Mujahideen who fought against the Russians. There were a great deal of weaponry around and about that was able to be used by these people. The Tajiks had not been able to establish the same kind of effective control of the territory of Afghanistan that the Taliban was able to do after, what, about 96?
The Tajiks are a very small minority. They're only about 10 or 15%.
I see.
And it's quite obvious that a minority cannot control a majority. A majority can incorporate a minority. And so when the Taliban had, or the Pashtuns had swept over Afghanistan, the advice that was being given to them by all good-thinking people and neighbors was, don't try to do it alone. There is too much of a tribal structure in Afghanistan, so try to have a broad-based government, meaning incorporate the minority. But they did not see that as a fit political outcome, and that is where we got into a corner by having a so-called Northern Alliance, which is a sort of loose grouping of the Tajiks, the Uzbeks and the Hazaras. But obviously they don't agree with each other, because now that the Tajiks are in Kabul, the Hazaras are threatening to come in and fight them for control of Kabul.
And these ethnic identities and rivalries go back for hundreds of years. I mean, this is deep-rooted, something akin to what might be called nationalism as we think of it. We have an Uzbekistan, a Tajikistan, and so forth.
Not really.
But we don't have a Pashtunistan.
No. That's,
could you differentiate for me and maybe the audience? You say Pashtun, Taliban. Is the Taliban part of the Pashtun? Would the Pashtun by and large support the Taliban as having been a political representation of their tribal identity? Or what is the reality in terms of understanding those two elements?
I don't think all the Pashtuns would support the Taliban. If they did, we would have a major problem on our hands, because half of the country would then be supporting a particular form of government. The Pashtuns have different political views. Some of them supported the Taliban, others do not support the Taliban.
Do you have any idea of what the percentages might be?
Very difficult to tell.
It is.
But my own assumption would be that the majority of Afghans are basically non-extremist and moderate. They are conservative, but they do not follow the extremist, puritanical type of dispensation that the Taliban were trying to mete out to the population.
We've had these incredibly fast successes militarily on the ground of the Northern Alliance, taking Kabul and so forth, and that sort of thing. Do you think there will be a support of, let's say, at Kandahar? We're talking now on the 21st of November, a support of the Taliban elements that are down by Kandahar and that sort of thing? Or will there be a defection in terms of the Pashtun tribal peoples, in terms of the Taliban? And then we want to make a link between the Taliban, which is seen by Mr. Bush and by the alliance against that, as having been supportive of the Al-Qaeda and Mr. bin Laden himself. And so maybe you could put some of those things in perspective for us.
Well, that is the second element. The first is the tribal structure of Afghanistan. The second is the influx of people who came originally to help the Afghans throw the Russians out, but who were basically foreigners to Afghanistan.
They came from many lands.
They came from many lands, and many of them were Arabs. And they fought a battle, and then having completed the battle against the Russians, and as you rightly said, there was a lot of armaments. The Russians left about $30 billion worth of arms in Afghanistan when they retreated.
Apart from the things that had come in from the United States.
Yes. The Russian contribution is $30 billion of arms.
And the Russians are supporting more or less at this time the Northern Alliance?
Yes, of course.
With Mr. Putin,
Yes.
Okay.
So the problem now was that you have these foreigners, the so-called Arab Afghans, who were at a loose end and who then were looking for a cause, and the cause that they were found was to superimpose themselves on one of the frustrations that we were discussing earlier. And that is then what leads to the 11th of September. But our problem is...
Ours being Pakistan? Or the,
No,
I'm
yours
sorry.
and mine and everybody.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, our problem is that having bombed Afghanistan and possibly having isolated and ultimately eliminated the Taliban, we have a post-Taliban scenario to deal with in Afghanistan. And how are we going to deal with it? Afghanistan is a very important country because it has been a buffer between Central Asia and South Asia for hundreds of years.
That's right.
Everybody is therefore interested in maintaining its unity, its independence, and its existence as a buffer. Nobody wants Afghanistan to disappear into small ethnic balkanized states or to divide it between North and South.
Yeah. And then from the standpoint of Pakistan itself, if it had an unfriendly power on that frontier, it would be a very difficult situation for the country of Pakistan, would it not?
That, of course, is a complicating factor, because that would then give Pakistan a two-front danger,
India and
which
Afghanistan
would be very difficult for it. But that is not the real reason for Pakistan's interest is because I told you, history, culture, family ties, neighborhood, long border, porous border, etc. Now, how do we construct that post-Taliban Afghanistan? That is what we really have to work for.
The world is confronted with that now.
All of us. This is our problem now. And I don't know how the dice will fall. But I would imagine that there are 5 points that are important here. The first is for us to understand that the future of Afghanistan is not decidable either by the United States or by Pakistan or by the United Nations. It can only be decided by the Afghans themselves. So we have to know that it's their country. Our job is to facilitate a situation where they can get together and decide the future of a peaceful, united, independent Afghanistan.
Do you think we adequately, the nations of the world adequately helped in that regard following the withdrawal of the Soviet Union, or did we abandon to ethnic violence and even to a certain sense, maybe in a certain sense, abandon Pakistan, the United States now I'm thinking, and that what is different and what can we do in order to try and stave off the ethnic violence between the people and the political dissension and get a united Afghanistan, whereas we haven't succeeded in the past, given these ethnic animosities and so forth, which run so deep.
If we understand that it's their country and they have to put it in order,
the Afghans,
then the second point would be get the leaders together and have them discuss some sort of an interim arrangement. Now, this is what's going to be done next week in Germany. We are not yet sure as to who will be the leaders who will be actually participating in this meeting.
They've had trouble trying to do that, haven't they?
Of course, and you have to have a representative group, because you have to bring a critical mass of leaders together to decide on an interim arrangement. In the meantime, and this is point number 3, Kabul has to be demilitarized. Kabul cannot be full of arms, because if it has arms inside the capital, Kabul is the icon, the symbol of national unity. If it gets taken by one faction, then there is going to be civil war in Afghanistan exactly as in 1992.
Well, it has in a certain sense, has it not? I mean, maybe you can set me straight. The Northern Alliance itself, it's, you know, the 3, but the military successes outran the political context where they hadn't had the talks and they went in and took Kabul, and that the military successes have been in advance of the political context, or is that a problem?
But it is not a military success of the Northern Alliance.
No, it's our problem.
It is a United States military success which created a total vacuum, and clear indications were given by the United States to the Tajiks and the Northern Alliance not to move into Kabul.
And then they did.
And they did.
They did, and why wouldn't they? I mean, because they would take the thing.
But it was because they used the vacuum. But in the process, a danger now exists of civil war in Afghanistan if they had played the game, which they haven't. and which they did not in 1992-94 also.
So that's...
Then we would have had a chance. But now we have to make sure that they come together in this meeting in Germany and they understand that demilitarization of Kabul and getting an interim government is essential.
I wonder if I could ask you something, maybe it's a little, we have these ethnic identities that seem to be so strong, Pashtun and so on. Will the people there, will they feel, and where did the word, if I can, because we talk about them as Afghanis, all, where did the word Afghanistan come from? What does it connote? It's got all these different things. And do they identify themselves as Afghanistan, or do they identify themselves as Pashtun and Tajik and so forth first? And what is there about Afghanistan that is unity among these different people that could be repaired to in terms of trying to get some sort of a effective unity? Is there a strong sense of Afghan unity?
Afghan, the word Afghan is a very old word. It's at least 1,000 years old.
That's pretty old.
So there is definitely some such thing as an identity which is Afghan and which is 1,000 years old. But what we call Afghanistan today is a buffer. It's a buffer designed to keep the British Empire separate from Tsarist Russia. And now we are later on in history, we are living in the 21st century, so we have to go forwards from where we are. And that means the independence of Afghanistan. And just because it's a mountain territory, we cannot allow it to degenerate into ethnic tribalisms.
There are unhappy signs that seems to be, that's what happened in the 90s?
Yes.
And it seems to be...
But a better effort is being made now. Because for one, I think we are all wiser.
We have attention.
No, we are wiser. And I would hope that even the Tajiks, the Northern Alliance, is also wiser. Because the mess that was created was of their creation in 1993-94. But the Afghans have another fourth very interesting system. It's a tribal structure. And they have a tribal concept of democracy which is fascinating, which is called the Loi Jirga, or the Grand Assembly.
Yeah, we've seen this.
In which the elders from all over the country, and in large numbers, come and get together, and they decide then how Afghanistan should be run. If we can somehow get the Afghans to sit together in a Loi Jirga, I think we will have won the battle against instability.
Do you think we'll be able to do that?
The Loi Jirga can only be called inside Afghanistan. It can only be called by a person who has the authority to call a Loi Jirga. And these are tall orders when you are dealing with...
Is this the king we see is coming back or something?
If he would be acceptable to the Afghans. But there are many Afghans hold it against the king that when they were fighting against the Russians for 10 years, he was not part of that battle for life and death because he was in Rome at the time. So there is some dissatisfaction there.
And in the time of the fighting in the Soviet Union, they had support from the United States. They don't have that now. And
Who
in fact,
does not?
those who were fighting against the Soviet Union do not have that. Or the United States was an... you do, okay, I see.
The United States was committed during the fight against the Russians.
Yes.
Is committed currently because of Osama bin Laden and the Taliban. And the question is the United States commitment going to be deep and of long duration enough to be able to sustain the type of the action that is required in order to overcome the difficulties of Afghanistan? It may take 2, 3, 4, 5 years. There is a figure of about $6.2 billion which has been mentioned for the reconstruction of Afghanistan. And obviously $6 billion is not a small amount of money.
Not at all, no. There was a great deal spent in the 80s too. There was a great deal spent there. And I wonder, another thing that comes up is that they've had 4 years, 5 years of drought. The conditions for the people, the Afghanistani people, are absolutely abysmal. There are people that they've been living in a very real sense, in a survival sense. We get the picture of on international aid and so forth. We've been bombing people. There's been disruption and so forth. What are your prospects? What is your view of the prospects for being able to sufficiently get food and immediate support for the people that have been, they're coming down toward the Pakistani border now? We've got a real problem. Has the aid effort been disrupted by the bombing and so forth that has been taking place? Or is it going to be, has it been with the the rapid victories of the Northern Alliance and so forth, is it creating stability enough to where sufficient amounts of, trucks and so forth that can get food in to help those people? What's the prospect with winter looming in that part of the country at the very elemental level of survival?
Well, basically, food in Afghanistan has gone through Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
It's a landlocked country.
Yes, indeed.
And the simplest and cheapest and shortest route is through Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
And so Afghanistan, which is dependent on two things, on wheat and on kerosene. Kerosene is a fuel and a heating. It's used for cooking and heating.
Yes.
Both these have really gone through Pakistan into Afghanistan. And the takeoff will be there and will be fast, because while winter slows things down, movement can still continue through the roads between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The problem is that at the moment everything was disrupted.
Yes.
Because of the bombing and the insecurity, and we don't quite know how long the bombing will have to last before the immediate objective of the 11th of September, which is a particular person in Osama bin Laden and a particular regime in the Taliban, before the two are constricted and constrained. We don't know how long that will take. But as long as conditions stabilize and the war at least ends, I think the food can go in fairly fast
And
into Afghanistan.
that's happened more rapidly than some had thought. With the rapid advance of the Northern Alliance, they're establishing that military control in league with the Western forces, as it were, so that you don't think there will be a fighting condition that's going to exacerbate the situation.
It may, we do not know.
We thought that we've been told that we get ready for a long, drawn-out struggle. Do you think that the facts on the ground, the military strength of the Northern Alliance and the Western-supported forces and so forth are going to be able to bring stabilization at a military level more rapidly than we thought, or is it going to be longer drawn out and bombing and so forth that disrupts the aid effort? That's the thing.
Well, there are two struggles in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
There is an American struggle against the perpetrators of the 11th of September.
Yeah, they're in a cave somewhere or something.
And there is an Afghan struggle among themselves.
Yes, that's right.
And these two are both going to complicate each other.
Yeah, I know. So I'm wondering what's going to happen to the folks. That's what I'm
your
saying.
question was, will the folks get wheat and kerosene?
Yeah, because...
And my answer is,
You think so?
anything, as long as the roads are open, the United Nations and others will be able to move in the food.
You've had a long experience in the United Nations. The United States has been building a coalition. There's a great deal of a coalition widespread against terrorism, yet to be defined in a certain definitive sense, seems to me what we mean by that. But that this is going. What's the role, do you see, particular role for the United Nations, particularly in terms of the events developing in that, in the Pakistan and Afghanistan?
Inevitable and irreplaceable. Because what we need is an honest, neutral broker. That honest, neutral broker can only be either the United Nations or the Organization of the Islamic Conference. One of these two will have to act as the honest broker to bring the Afghans together, to get a political dispensation, to create some sort of a peacekeeping force which may not be able to impose peace, but which can keep fighting factions separate so that they don't waste their energy fighting each other, and so that the food and the kerosene and fuel can move into Afghanistan, and of course the reconstruction and rehabilitation effort. Don't forget that we still have 2.5 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan today.
Yeah,
and they've been there for 20 years.
Yes, indeed.
And they have cost Pakistan approximately $1 billion $1 million a day for 20 years.
And Pakistan has great problems of her own.
Obviously, because when you have this large a number of refugees, there's a fallout which takes place in law and order, in drugs, in guns and things like that.
Exactly, yeah. And you also have on your other border, you have India, which is, you've had Kashmir is a very much of a flashpoint in terms of this. So up in the north you have Kashmir, and then you have the Afghanistan. There's a great deal of pressure on the country of Pakistan, and it's a crucial linchpin in terms of the understanding how things might be able to emerge in a better way. Are you optimistic about the stability of Pakistan itself? And are you cognizant, or are you cognizant in a way that I wouldn't be, in terms of potential backlash, if that's the right term, from other elements from the Islamic world against the quote-unquote war on terrorism, that there might be reaction or destabilization of other systems in the Islamic world as a result of American military action?
Well, Pakistan, to begin with, is a very large country. It's 140 million people, which means that even if there is 0.01% of dissidents, and Pakistan has great freedom of opinion, and the street and the press offers you great opportunities for expressing political opinions very freely. So even if you are 0.001% of the population, you still get a critical mass of people out expressing an opinion. We're not too worried about it, because I think this is totally containable. So stability is not the problem at all.
You're talking about Pakistan?
Yes, it would be a problem. Pakistan, of course. It would be a problem if this continued for too long, and if more and more Afghan refugees started coming into Pakistan, because the effect of the refugees is very deep on Pakistan.
Yes, I should
And
think.
as you rightly said, Kashmir is a complicating factor.
Very much.
Because
How many have we lost?
Kashmir is the unfinished business of partition. It is a territory which is recognized as a disputed area by the United Nations, which means by the United States and all other countries of the world, with the exception of India. India is the only country in the world which does not recognize Kashmir as a disputed territory. And so we have a problem in Kashmir. And
I wonder if the world recognizes that sufficiently. There's a great deal of attention on the Palestinian situation, the difficulty in Kashmir, and the fight that goes on in terms of that continues, and it's not been well enough understood in the United States by the general society.
I don't think people here know.
There have been a great number of loss of life.
The Indians have 600,000 troops.
Honestly, that is true? 600,000?
600,000.
It's incredible.
And more than 60,000 Kashmiris have been killed in the past 10 years alone. But obviously...
and some mujahideen have been there.
Yes, and that is the linkage, and it's a dangerous linkage.
And they feel that they're occupied, and that the UN resolutions that called for a plebiscite and so forth have never been met, and so forth. So that's a flashpoint.
Of course it is.
And that's a very difficult thing. And it's crucial to the thinking of the political thinking within Pakistan. That's something that is very much front and center in terms of their
But it should be
thinking.
crucial to the political thinking of everybody.
Yes, indeed.
Your audience, the United States, even to the Indians, it should be crucial for them to understand the importance of Kashmir, because even India, they must be spending something like $4 billion a year on maintaining their troops in Kashmir. So why not spend that money on the uplift of poverty and of education both in India and in Pakistan?
Yeah, and there was a piece in the paper by Tom Friedman saying India is a democracy, and you have 150 Muslims in India integrating well, and that we need to look at that as an issue. So there's a tilting. Do you think there's a tilting toward India on this issue that would be upsetting to a number of people from Pakistan?
I don't know about the tilt, but if Mr. Friedman thinks it's a democracy, then Mr. Friedman should first go and start counting the troops, Indian troops in Kashmir, and the number of people who are dead at the hands of Indian troops, which in other words, adds up to state-sponsored terrorism. And I do not see how a democracy can be indulging in state-sponsored terrorism.
Back to the question we started with about the use of force and power, and that's part of that's part of realpolitik that is being advanced now in the name of in the name of the world. And whether or not, do you think there's going to be, from your perspective, you have a long and distinguished career over many parts of the world. You understand? What is your assessment? We only got a couple of minutes left. Of the, let's say, if we begin to try and look out a year, 2 years, this question of terrorism, is it going to, if we do get Mr. bin Laden, do you think that this will pass and so forth? Or do you think there's going to be a problem of the disinherited masses of the world, in a certain sense, breaking out in various parts of the world and questioning the system that's in place? Or do you think power of those that are in positions of leadership can assert themselves with a definitiveness that would lock the, you know, would move away from the dangers of people that would try to destabilize the system that's in place?
I think it would be an oversimplification.
Yes, I'm sure.
To believe that Mr. Osama bin Laden is responsible
for all this,
for all frustrations
yeah,
and motivations, and which means that
we've done that to a degree. I mean,
yeah, but we will slowly have to begin concentrating on the root causes,
yeah,
and on addressing them one by one or all of them together. Without addressing the root causes, we will not have a world that is safe from terrorism.
And the root causes are, on a large world scale, have to do with the system, the inadequacy, intellectual or otherwise. We're coming 200,000 years, Ahmad, we've been on this planet. We can destroy the species now with the weapons of destruction that have existed only perhaps in the last 20 years or so. And we have an incredible capability of providing life support with our technological augmentation, and we seem not to have a system that makes it possible to, in a systems way, include the whole of that within a vision. And for lack of vision, that would be on the part of the world leadership itself. So is it, Pogo said, we have found the enemy and it is us? Is it in the intellectual vision of the world leadership that needs to think about changes that would be able to resonate in the hearts and minds of the people of this world?
I would imagine so.
You think it is? The challenge is there.
Yes, and I think if the 11th of September encourages all of us to think and address root causes and address them, and to have the type of dialogue that you are talking about in terms of the intellectual challenge, then all those who died on the 11th of September will not have died in vain.
Are you optimistic that such leadership will be able to emerge? And
I think so, because this is an event of such magnitude that it has to produce ultimately a positive result.
Well, we live at a time where if the gods of war and injustice, let's say, and so forth, are let loose after 200,000 years again of evolution, it may be that we're at a time of, as we say, it's to reflect on that we can now destroy the species if we get locked in with alliances and the ancient hatreds, the lack of vision, and that sort of thing. So it's a real crucial time now. And the obverse side of that might be a almost liberating capability of us to take our collectively understood extension of consciousness and technology and information technology, these things that are coming now, to make the planet in a systems way, one that includes all of the people in a new and liberated context. It's a time of great and tremendous challenge, isn't it?
And of excitement,
yes,
because it is all there. We are in a shrinking world, and we are aware of its shrinkingness, and that encourages us to sit and talk and address the problems jointly.
And then sometimes do it on television so we can begin to share it. And I really thank you. It's really good. As always, it's really a pleasure to welcome you to the Manhattan Network Studios. And we on Conversations invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week. It's been your pleasure to have the perceptions of Ambassador Ahmad Kamal. He was the former ambassador until just recently of Pakistan at the United Nations. He's now president of the Ambassadors Club at the United Nations, which is doing important work. We didn't get a chance to talk to it in another program. We might, in terms of educating the world about the significance of the United Nations and international developments. Once again, thank you really very much for coming in, and we on Conversations will see you next week. Until next time. So we scratched the surface of I still am very interested in economic theory. I know. I think we're going to need some sort of an economic theory. You studied economics, huh?
Yes.
I think we need to get some sort of beyond the.
Yes.
Mr. Keynes and Mr. Schumpeter and Mr. Van Hayek and Mr. Friedman and the things that inform our political process, much less Mr. Marx and so on, even somehow that we need a new economic theory about how we can let this technology.
We can discuss this sometime.